Hello and welcome back to the program. I'm Dana Lash. And don't forget, tweet us at #DailyDana on Twitter. The White House sent its $4.1 trillion spending plan to Capitol Hill today, actually yesterday. President Trump is looking to balance the budget in 10 years with big spending cuts and faster economic growth. Lawmakers unpacked the Trump budget amid little fanfare. The proposal matches many of what the president had promised voters on the campaign trail, which called for increasing funding for defense and border security while leaving Medicare and Social Security retirement untouched. Now, Democrats were not thrilled with the budget. They don't like the $3.6 trillion in cuts to programs like Medicaid and food stamps and Social Security disability insurance. Some Republicans are nervous because of cuts and because the budget assumes 3% economic growth, a number too rosy for some economists. Let's go to Dan Mitchell of the Cato Institute on this one. Dan, welcome to the program. Always good to see you. What do you make of the Trump budget? It's been called cruel by some. It's been called it doesn't do enough by others. Where do you stand on it?
The first thing to understand is, let's get the numbers honest. There are no cuts in this budget. Federal spending will grow by an average of 3.46% a year for the next 10 years. Now, that's a lot of cuts compared to that baseline that assumes ever-growing spending levels, but the government's going to grow faster than inflation. And so all these special interest groups that are whining that somehow there's a savage, draconian austerity descending upon the country, no, it's just a modest bit of spending restraint.
It seems as though it's kind of kicking the can a little bit in terms of entitlement reforms, because nothing really done to it, and that's really the driver. That's the biggest thing on which we're spending money.
Well, the good news is that Trump is doing a lot on what are called the means-tested entitlement programs. In other words, Medicaid, food stamps, traditional sort of social welfare spending. Those programs are being reformed and restrained. But he's not really doing anything on Medicare and Social Security. And in the long run, if we don't want to become Greece, we better do something about those programs. So I guess you would give him at best an incomplete on the old age entitlements.
Yes, well, that's true. And a lot of the Senate Senate GOP conference, they were kind of walking away from this thing. They don't like it so much. Do you think it doesn't, just from all the talk that I'm hearing about it, it doesn't look like it's going to have much of a chance in the Senate?
Two things to understand. The Senate Republicans last year, when Obama was in the White House, they voted for a budget that had just as much spending restraint as what we see in Trump's budget. So were they sort of just being fake then? Were they positioning, pretending to be fiscal conservatives? But I understand what they're doing, because a lot of people in Washington think that Trump's just going to introduce this budget and walk away from it, that he's not serious. So if you're a Republican politician and you get on board and you're waving the flag and saying, I'm going to vote for this budget, I think it's great, there's going to be no follow-through. At least that's the concern of a lot of people in the White House. But here's the key thing to understand. Trump has tremendous power, assuming he's willing to veto spending bills that don't give him what he wants. Now, you don't have to pass a reconciliation bill so the entitlements might be protected, but you have to pass the appropriations bills. And Trump is proposing actual, genuine cuts in domestic discretionary spending. In other words, not just smaller increases, which is what the special interest groups call a cut. He's actually saying for domestic discretionary programs, he wants to spend less every year over the next 10 years. That would be a lot of savings, and he can enforce that by simply vetoing spending bills that don't fulfill it. Now, that would mean a government shutdown fight. Trump has to learn. He got rolled in the last government shutdown fight. He needs to learn that his veto is very powerful.
Very powerful indeed. One of those senators, Lindsey Graham, spoke out and said that a lot more Benghazis are going to happen if they have these defense cuts in this budget bill, which to me, just not to get into that particular situation, but for him to allege that kind of went against all the testimony and everything that we heard before Senate Intel Committee. It wasn't a budget issue. It was a little disingenuous for Graham to say that, but to me, I thought it was as much of a fear-mongering tactic as Bernie Sanders going out there and saying, oh, this is cruel. People are going to die because you're going to cut welfare.
In the State Department budget, Trump is proposing to get rid of a lot of foreign aid. And I think that's good, not just from the perspective of it as an American taxpayer, but foreign aid programs tend to simply enrich third world governments. They don't actually lead to more economic growth. So I'm all in favor of cutting back on foreign aid spending, and that's most of the budget savings in the State Department are for that and for international bureaucracies like the UN and the OECD. And those are things that Lindsey Graham and other Republicans should be supporting. We're not talking about security at embassies. We're talking about money that's currently being wasted on programs and bureaucracies that don't deliver value for the money.
Absolutely. Now, on top of the budget as well, Dan, the Congressional Budget Office, they're releasing its report on the final House Republican health care plan. That passed the lower chamber weeks ago. That CBO score is obviously going to stir the debate in the Senate. There are some reports that GOP senators, they're crafting their own version of the bill because they're worried that the Trump administration is going to let insurance markets collapse. What are your thoughts on that?
Insurance markets are already collapsing. Obamacare is a giant failure. It's like this big tumor on the growing on our economy. But the problem is that a lot of Republicans, especially in the Senate, and we saw, of course, some in the House as well, are very nervous that once you sort of hook people on the heroin of government dependency, once you're giving them subsidies and handouts, and whether the handouts go to individuals or to the insurance companies, it's very hard to sort of put the toothpaste back in the tube. But if we don't reform and at least largely repeal Obamacare, we already have a collapsing insurance market. We already have a system that is fundamentally broken, and not just because of Obamacare, because of all the government intervention that has built up over decades in the healthcare sector. So we desperately need to begin to fix that. If Senate Republicans get nervous, well, then they better enjoy their 1 year and 8 months left of being in the majority, because they're going to vote themselves into the minority by leaving this festering sore of Obamacare on the American economy.
Absolutely. Dan Mitchell with Cato. Dan, always so good to see you. Thank you.
Hey, Dana.